Classes in Wargame Design, a series of lectures based on George Philly's book, Designing Board Wargames, Introduction, to be available from Smashwords.com and Amazon Kindle. And today, Lecture 5, Maps, Terrain. Welcome to Lecture 5 on Maps and Gridding. Unfortunately, the electronic record of my actual lecture didn't do too well, so we are instead going to have me lecture directly out of the book, using the pretty pictures that can be seen in the book to indicate what is going on. Our lecture today is primarily concerned with maps, gridding, terrain features, and how they can be represented on the game board. The basic image of a wargame is a big map, and on the little big map are objects, little plastic counters, cardboard squares, whatever, that represent the military units. The military units may be people or ships or army groups, whatever. Nonetheless, there is on the map an area where we're going to have a battle of some sort, and there are the things that are going to fight the battle. The first question is, exactly where are each of those objects located with respect to the map? The simplest answer is to say the map is an exact representation of the area, the unit counters are exact representations of the units, and where sits the unit counter, there precisely is the unit. Now, that's okay if you're trying to do a historical image and you want to show a picture of a battle, but if you're moving units around, you have the issue that you start out, there's a unit at some location, it's allowed to move a certain distance in a certain amount of time, and in practical war games, you have to do something to coarse grain the time and distance coordinates. It's impractical in an orthodox board war game, as opposed to a real-time shooter, to have the units move continuously. Instead, the players have to take turns. The units in the allowed time of the turn are allowed to move so far, and then you have to determine where the units end up at the end of the turn. Now, the simplest solution to this, used by board wargamers since the time of H.G. Wells, is to say we see the toy soldier in front of us. I put down a ruler. I displace the toy soldier the allowed distance. The toy soldier has moved the allowed distance. The toy soldier is now next to the enemy unit and start swinging at it with its sword. That's fine, except if the allowed move is 6 inches, and the enemy is 7 inches away, the consequences of not quite being able to come in contact with the enemy can be quite severe. And there is then a certain amount of room for creative measurement of distances, disputes about what unit could have moved which far distance or how far, precisely where the units started, since of course once you've picked up a unit counter or a unit and moved it, the original location is not marked, and so forth. One solution to this is to say, well, we have the map and it's very pretty and we can see it, and we will then lay down on top of the map a grid, like a chessboard. Chess pieces only occupy one of 64 locations, 8 by 8, and all chess pieces can't even reach all of those locations. The poor pawns can never reach the file behind them. The answer to saying we have a grid is to say we will put down a grid, and instead of measuring in inches, we will count off some number of grid locations. For example, in chess, we have a pawn, and the pawn can move forward exactly 1 space, except on its first turn, when it's allowed to move forward 2 spaces. There can be no dispute that you've moved 1 space or 2 spaces. That's all you can do. So we do the same thing on a map. We lay down a grid, and we put the units on the grid. Now, where you put the units with respect to the grid actually has several solutions. In chess or checkers, you put the unit piece directly in the center of the square. That ends things. In the Japanese, Chinese, Korean game of Go, you don't put your stones, your unit counters, in the centers of the square. You put them on the grid intersections. And in fact, as we'll discuss in a few moments, there are 3 reasonable choices as to where you put the units with respect to the grid. There are also bunches of choices of different grids to use. Chess uses squares. Modern board war games use this gentleman. You see the label BB38 above the cursor. That is a hexagon. Hexagons have the feature, seen in much bathroom tile, that if you put down hexagons next to each other, they form a smooth, uniform grid that covers the entire map. Each hexagon is immediately adjacent to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of its neighbors. Now, having said the gridding is called hexagons, for historical reasons, the various different grid locations are all called, at least in Stalingrad, squares. So here we have a square, the square with 6 sides. The square comes with a little letter symbol, BB38. BB and 38 identify the grid location. They identify horizontal and vertical, not precisely on the straight lines, the location of this square with respect to all of the others. The 6 edges of the square, like this one, these are called hex edges. There are also points like this where multiple squares and hex edges come together. Those are vertices. In Stalingrad, unit counters sit in the middle of squares. Here's an archetypical Stalingrad unit counter, the 236. You see, 2, 3, 6. It's sitting in the middle of its square. The game rules could have been written to permit the unit counter to be placed elsewhere. You could have arranged the rules so all unit counters were placed on vertices, intersections. You could have written the rules so unit counters were placed on edges. However, the rules as written put the unit counter more or less in the center of a square, and that is how Stalingrad is played. Now, what you see here is a computer image. In the real physical game, the things that you might have called unit counters are little squares of cardboard. Their corners may be rounded, as seen here, or square cut. The color schemes may be very different. There are typically a bunch of numbers printed on them. There is an object here that indicates the type of unit and how big it is. We'll cover all of these in a moment. But here is the unit counter. It's sitting in the middle of a square. And here are some more unit counters. The additional unit counters you're now looking at, the sort of red one is a Russian, the gray one is a German, the pale blue-green ones are German allies, Finns, Romanians, Italians, Hungarians. Those are the unit counters in the real game, little squares of cardboard with which the battle is fought. Now, we can point out a few of the features here. Each of these units has 1, 2, 3 numbers printed at the bottom. The first is a measure of the attack strength, the attack factor. The second is a measure of the defense strength, the defense factor. The third is an indication of the ability to move, the movement factor. If you're designing your own game, you don't have to call them attack factor, movement factor, defense factor. You can choose to be original. But there is a price for originality, namely if you call these factor A, factor B, and factor C, and maybe print them at the bottom in some different order, the poor player has to memorize your new coding in order to play your game. That creates a resistance to learning the game, and in the long run will cut into sales. Now, there are a couple of other bits on here. You'll notice there is a circular mark here. You see the oval? It looks like a tank tread. That's because this is an armored unit. There's a diagonal slash on the unit here. The diagonal slash represents cavalry. In principle, it represents a cavalry saber. And the X, you see the X? The X represents the infantry. The crossed lines are perhaps the belting across the chest that holds the pack up. There's also this row of 3 little X's directly above the unit type. That list of 3 X's tells us the size of the unit. You're looking at an Army Corps. The smaller unit, the division, would only have 2 X's. The unit smaller than that, the brigade, would have only 1 X. The little flag symbols, like this one, and this red star, and there is a German plus sign, those represent the nationality. However, there's a bit of chrome involved here. There are only 2 types of units in the game in terms of ownership: Russian, and all these 5 are German. They may have had troops from other countries in them. All those units, the gray and the blue-green, belong to the German player. The red units belong to the Russian player. The circle or X or cross, the type of unit, has no effect on play. It happens that all armor and cavalry have 6 movement points, and all infantry has 4 movement points, but the 6 and the 4 are displayed on the unit, so there's no new information there. Finally, you'll notice, for example, here is a 15. Now the German, here is a 6. Those numbers are the unit identifiers. The unit identifiers have no direct effect on the game. That is, every 236 is the same. Every German 444 is the same in terms of all of its rules properties. However, the unit identifiers let the player specify which unit he is talking about when he gets to point A or point B or point C. Sometimes that ability to tell the other player, I am talking about the 15th armor, this 236, and not the 2nd armor, another 236, sometimes that distinction has a consequence. Okay, we're going to display this again, and we are displaying the different types of units. So here's infantry with an X. Here is armor, the ellipse. Here is cavalry with a slash. And the superposed infantry and cavalry is armored infantry. The German is Panzergrenadier. So you have different types of units, and they have abbreviations. When we refer to units by identifier, for example, 57, it is useful to indicate which type of unit you're talking about. And the usual indication is a circle, a little O if it's an armor, a little X if it's infantry, a backslash if it's cavalry, and G, an O or an X if it's armored infantry. But you can also abbreviate the units by the shortened form of their names, namely INF, infantry, ARM, tank units. So this is a tank corps, CAV, cavalry, and PG, motorized infantry. So we have these various ways to reference units which are sometimes useful. Oh yes, you notice there are 2 little horizontal lines here, and this color up here and that color down there are different. And this color is not the same as the above or the below. All that is pretty decoration that has no effect on the play of the game. The purpose of that pretty decoration is to impress the player with the skill of the artist, and it is impressive. And I now supply you, this is a figure from the book, the different information features on a unit counter, a Stalingrad counter, so you see what they all are. There's the size of the unit. All Stalingrad units are corps. There is the type of unit. This is armor. There is the attack factor, the defense factor, and the movement factor. Those numbers matter. There is the unit identifier, this is the 57th, and then there is a little symbol, there's the German plus sign. For the German allies there are little flags. The unit identifier, the nationality, occasionally are relevant to play because there are certain restrictions on movement and replacement that affect some German units differently from others. So we've now looked at unit counters, and we'll start with terrain. And so here is a terrain feature. You see it's a square, C39. It's filled in with blue. Now, if you were really picky, you might wish that the artist, in drawing this, had pushed that line between blue and tan away from the vertex, and ditto here, push the line a little bit away from the vertex so it's completely clear that this entire square is solid blue. C39 is a lake square. The square is underwater. Lake squares have the feature that they're impassable. You can't move units onto them unless they are frozen, which happens in snow weather. We haven't talked about snow weather yet. As an alternative to our lake square, consider, here's another blue square. This blue square has the feature its neighbors are all blue too. We're out in the middle of the ocean someplace. Here's a sea square, a square completely covered by ocean. Units are not allowed to enter this square at any time, summer or winter, so you notice there's no label identifying the square. There's no point to it. And now we'll advance and point at a bunch of different types of terrain feature at the same time. So here are some lake squares, the blue. Here is a square that contains both blue and tan. This is a coast square. Coast squares function as land. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, those are all coast squares. They all function as land squares. You can move units on them. This land square is like the very first square we looked at. It's clear terrain. There's nothing on it. These other squares do have things on it. The black line with the cross hatches representing railroad tracks is a railroad line. And the railroad line is a linear feature that goes from square to square to square. The blue lines directly above the arrow on square G34, the blue lines that run along as shown, are a river. The rivers also run through the middle of squares. Now you could have put them someplace else. Some designers like the more old-fashioned approach of putting the river lines on square edges, but here we see a river going through the center of a square. Finally, there is this beryl green and some darker lines feature. That is a marsh, a swamp square. The little sideways blue lines next to the cursor, you see the little sideways blue lines? If you view them facing sideways on the page, they look sort of like reeds in a marsh, and that's the symbol for marsh squares. We'll look at another marsh square in a few seconds. Here is a marsh square. It's square BB18. It has a variety of lighter and darker blue features on it. The entire square is filled with blue, so there can be no doubt that this is a marsh square. Swamp. An important artistic feature is that if you are laying things out, you need to be very careful that as you lay them out, it's unambiguous which type of terrain is in each square. This square clearly has nothing but swamp in it. It's a swamp square. On the other hand, here we have a mountain square. And the mountain has different shadings of brown, light, middle, mottled, dark. This is a mountain square. It's TT33. It's rough terrain, mountainous. An important technical issue, though, comes up right here. You notice this is a clear terrain square. As far as you can see, it's pale gray. This is a mountain square. It's brown. If you are printing the map in a multi-pass full-color printing process as opposed to doing something on a computer screen or doing something on a laser printer where everything goes down at the same time, there is a technical issue with printing known as registration. The issue in registration is you put one color down on the paper, you put another color down on the paper, and the two colors have to line up, meaning the printing press must be very accurate about feeding the paper from space to space so all of the colors print in the right place. A wise artist will take note of this fact, and instead of having the brown come exactly up to the gray hex edge, she will draw things so that the edge of the mountain square is very slightly in from the hex edge, and therefore there is no likelihood that as a result of improper registration, this brown will print a tiny bit into the neighboring square where it does not belong. Registration is the sort of issue that comes up if you're concerned with serious graphics and the actual physical limitations of the color process. And having given us units and areas rather in two colors and units in more colors, I will now point out the technical issue again, which I've spoken about before, namely there are two color processes involved. For computer screens, the colors are generated as red, green, blue, RGB colors by addition. In printing, you could have RGB colors, but you could also very well have CMYK. CMYK stands for cyan, magenta, yellow, black, and CMYK colors are not quite the same. And with respect to, we could convert one into the other, this turns out to be trickier than it sounds, to put it mildly. Okay, so we have now looked at several different types of terrain that fill the entire square. And here's one more type of terrain that fills the entire square. We see here the city of Kiev. It's on square EE21. The symbol for a city is a solid gray shading. Please note we are on the Cooper map, so the map you will see on Sun Tzu. Filled in are these little white blocks. Those represent buildings. Actually, Kiev has a lot more buildings in it than this, but you're showing a few buildings, so you get the idea there are buildings here. Flowing next to the city, you see a river here and a river there. You see dark lines with crosshatches here and here. Those are railroads. What happens to the river and railroads when we enter the city of Kiev? Well, they really get in, and there's a question on how you handle it, but we're going to talk about a few other terrain features first. You see the circle? The circle, I've marked it with a red arrow so you can't easily miss it, is a minor city. This is the minor city of Nikolaev. Minor cities have absolutely no effect whatsoever on the play of the game. They're there, they sit there, but they don't do anything. They are chrome. They're purely decorative, like the funny shiny strips they put on 1950s automobiles to show off and highlight the tail fins. And here is a railroad. The railroad runs across one hex edge, it runs across another hex edge, it's continuous in between, and it is this dark gray line with crosshatching. The square that a railroad occupies is described as a rail square. Okay, we've now stepped ahead a bit, and here is a river. Here are some rivers again. Dark blue center, paler blue edge, dark edge beyond that. The river flows through the center of the square. It never laps over a teeny bit into a neighboring square, at least it shouldn't. And you can immediately tell O37 and P36, those two squares are river squares. They've got rivers running through them. And now we have a river end square. The river end square is identifiable because the river comes along, and stops. Each river has two ends. The other end of the river end square flows into a body of water. The fact that the river end square, or rather the river square, flows into a body of water does not mean we have a river end square there. It just means the river gets a bit wider, so, for example, too far to see across. It is significant that this river end square points at square HH16. The rules distinguish between squares at which river ends point and squares at which river ends do not point. That distinction is important and has to be preserved on the map. And so we come back and we have looked at several different terrain features, so let us look at this piece of map which we've seen before again. The square here is clear terrain. It's also a coast square. This square is also clear terrain, but it's also a coast square. It's got a piece chewed off by the lake, and it's a railroad square. There's a railroad running through it. This square is variously a river square. See the river here. A rail square, there's a rail there. A coast square, it borders on water. It's not a swamp because the swamp has been very carefully printed so the beryl green does not lap over into square J34. On the other hand, here's square K33. Square K33 is a swamp square, it's blue-green, but it's also a coast square, there's the coastline, and a rail square. So one square can have several different types of terrain in it. Terrain is significant for affecting movement and combat. And because it's significant for affecting movement and for affecting combat, you have to keep clear all of the different types of terrain that are in each square. I will now give a little artistic issue in which the artist who did our Sun Tzu map made a specific decision. Here's the city of Kiev again. You notice the river seems to stop at the two edges? That's an artistic decision. It's a positive artistic decision in the sense that you can very clearly see this is a river square. It is a more complicated artistic decision, though, because square EE21 is indeed a river square. A river does flow through it, and therefore units defending on the far side or near side of the river, units defending on one side of the river or the other, get a combat benefit against any units attacking out of Kiev. So it is significant that Kiev is a river square. However, besides that, you see the railroads coming in? All of the railroads connect in the middle, so Kiev functions as a railroad square, and a unit coming along from EE20 can move into Kiev using rail movement and just continue on its merry way, still using rail movement, and it's not delayed as a result. However, some people would say, gee, you could have done a bit better than that. And here is an alternative way to handle the city on a river. This is my redrawing. You can tell it's a city square because the red squares, closed and open, represent buildings. You can tell it's a river square because the river really does run through it. Cynics would suggest that this building should be under the river, not on top, so there's no doubt that the river runs through it. Furthermore, the railroads come along like this, and like that, and like that, and are clearly joined at the middle, so there is absolutely no doubt that the railroad runs continuously through the square. That continuity is important for two reasons. First, if you are moving along a railroad from square to square to square, you must move along the railroad tracks if you are using rail movement. If the three rail points were not connected in the middle, it would be unclear that you could use rail movement to go from here to here to here. Furthermore, You can only change rail lines at junctions, and it is clearly shown that there's a junction here, so you can proceed down to here and then straight down, or you could proceed from up here down to here and then the other way. So by redrawing the map as indicated, you have improved the clarity. Now, are either of these a particularly better or worse representation than the actual city of Kiev or an aerial map? Several points here. Number one, drawing a wargame map by taking an aerial photograph and then just superposing a grid on it without thinking about where the terrain features are usually works very poorly. In fact, there was a homework exercise on this, and you were supposed to do the entire campus of my university and put a grid down on it, and if you weren't careful, you managed to have, given the rule was you could not move into a building except through doors, and a building square is a square with any amount of building in it, you could very easily arrange things so that a line of travel was impassable. The buildings were too close together, at least as interpreted on the grid, even though if you actually went there and looked, you'd notice there was plenty of room to drive 2 or perhaps even 3 large trucks right by each other. One more terrain feature. Here we see the Kerch Straits, described as the Straits of Azov. PP22 and PP23 are both coast squares. There's clear terrain here, there's water there. These two clear terrain squares do neighbor each other, but there's this blue line in the middle because there's a body of water here, the Straits of Azov. There are no other points on the Stalingrad map where you get 2 adjoining land pieces, and there's no connection by land between them. There are special rules on what happens if you put enemy units on adjoining squares, how you move units across in one direction and the other, and similar such issues. So there's the Straits of Azov. It's a specific terrain feature. There's only one of them on the whole map. Okay, and now we have come to an object which is not a terrain feature. You see the very dark black hatched lines. The very dark black hatched lines are the boundary between 2 countries. This is described as the Axis-Soviet border. The Axis is over here. The Soviets are over here. Now, you have to become a little careful on this because there are several other national boundaries. Hungary has boundaries on each side. There is a boundary between Romania and Greece and Bulgaria. There are a bunch of boundaries in there that are not the Axis-Soviet border. The Axis-Soviet border is important for one reason, namely, at the start of the game, the Russian units must be on the Soviet side of the border, that's over here, and the German units must be on the German side of the border, which is over here. And indeed, the further rule is the Russians can start the game with their units immediately adjacent to enemy terrain, so Russian units could start here and here and here and here. German units have to start 1 square back from the border. It is interesting to note we are in a period when Poland was divided between several pieces, one of which was in fact the general government, another of which was in fact Prussia. Those borders are not indicated. Characteristically, board wargames have complicated sequences of play. That is, different things happen at different times in a different order, and that order is fundamental to the rules. We see this already in chess, where first one player moves a piece, then the other player moves a piece. After the piece is moved, if it's landed on a square occupied by an enemy piece, that piece is removed from the board. In a board war game, things are much more elaborate. In Stalingrad, we can break the turns into two pieces. There is a German turn, and then there is a Russian turn. The German turn and Russian turn together constitute one complete turn, and one complete turn corresponds to 1 month of play. At the start of each turn, the German and Russian consult the weather rules. It may be the case that the weather is good or bad. It may be the case that the German has to roll a die and determine what the weather will be for the turn. Uncertainty of weather in spring and fall can have a marked effect on play. It's now the turn of the German player. For both the German and the Russian player, there are some fundamental considerations. First of all, in a board war game, unlike chess or checkers, you don't move one piece and then it's the other guy's turn. You move more or less all of your units. It may not be exactly all of your units. It may be only some units, and things can get more complicated. But the spirit of the matter is that each side gets to move all of his units, and then the other side gets to do the same. So in the German turn, start of the turn, the German applies the isolation rule. There may be isolated units. And then the German takes replacements and perhaps reinforcements. At this stage, the German is allowed to move all of his pieces, subject to the movement rules, the terrain rules, the weather rules, the zone of control rules. But it's the German move. The German gets to move pieces. After the German has moved his pieces, we proceed to the movement phase. We proceed to the combat phase, in which, if there are German and Russian units next to each other, combat takes place according to the combat rules. Once combat has taken place and all attacks have been settled, it is the turn of the Russian player. The Russian player applies the isolation rule as appropriate, and then takes her replacements. Having done this, it is the turn of the Russian player to move. And the Russian player is entitled to move any or all of her units, subject to the same restrictions as before. There are movement limits, there are zone of control rules, there are terrain limits, but it is the turn of the Russian player, and in general she can move all of her pieces as she sees fit. Once her movement phase is over, we reach the Russian combat phase, in which the Russian is the attacker, just as in the German combat phase, the German is the attacker, and a process is put through to resolve all battles that take place. Once all battles have taken place, it is the end of the Russian turn. We have seen a German turn, we have seen a Russian turn, we have seen a complete turn. We have reached the end of the month. 1 month of play is over. So that is the play sequence of Stalingrad. Of course, in each of these lines, many details are buried, and we're going to be spending the next several lectures filling in each of these lines with what they mean.